Planet Earth is truly larger than we can comprehend. Not only are we mere dots of insignificance on its vast surface, but our Earth is actually home to several other smaller worlds too. 15 in total of what are known as worlds within worlds, or mini-worlds, exist hidden around our own and are only accessible through portals. They are not magical or artificial creations. They are a completely natural part of our planet's makeup, even if they do not fit in with our understanding of the natural world. Indeed, it is believed every world within our universe contains mini-worlds, or at least all of the planets we have explored by the 25th century have been shown to. This makes each planet something of a mini-universe of its own. Worlds within worlds, again based on our limited knowledge, are all roughly the size of a continent and can vary in multiple ways, though they are all similar to the world they exist within, in terms of atmosphere at least. Some are nothing but landmass, others are completely submerged underwater. They can be freezing, Arctic environments, or tropical rainforests, or arid deserts. In terms of life forms, meanwhile, many are inhabited by completely unique creatures, whilst others are inhabited by life forms from the host world who have crossed over into theirs. It all depends on where the portal to the mini-world is contained as to what may cross over from the host world, or vice versa, from life forms to magic to natural resources such as water. Portals to mini-worlds are also completely invisible to the naked eye, and there appears to be no rhyme or reason as to where these portals may appear, though, as we will see, they can be moved or even disrupted using magic, but otherwise remain static and can never be destroyed. Finally, each world does not simply have one portal to it either. Other than the crossover of some creatures and natural disasters, the worlds within worlds of Earth have generally tended to avoid crossing over with our reality in any meaningful capacity. Perhaps because the history of our world has been more chaotic than most other planets, not always through our own making. Still, there have been some notable incidents of mini-worlds influencing ours and vice versa, such as the following stories involving Casca. This mini-world was at least initially connected to ours via two portals, one in England and the other on the Golden Gate Bridge, though more would be created throughout England. Our knowledge of this world comes largely from a man named Owen Jackman, whose journey into Casca in the early 21st century led to it becoming the most documented of all the worlds within worlds. Owen's recollections of Casca were of course dismissed at the time and later crudely put together in the 23rd century from the scant remains of his memoirs to at least try to form a coherent narrative. Today, in the 25th century, there are still some skeptics about the world within worlds theory, as they were all ultimately closed off after the fall of Earth society, when the supernatural was finally exposed to the world at large. Reportedly, it was the people of Casca themselves who cast a spell sealing the portals off. They did this to prevent both the demons and the humans who attempted to retreat into the mini-worlds during the chaos after the fall to flood their worlds. Whilst this undoubtedly seems callous to us, given how the surface world has been known to exploit and abuse its own people, perhaps it was for the best. Still, numerous records from that dark time in human history, before the mini-worlds were sealed off, have helped to back up the information in Owen's surviving memoirs, providing what will be likely the most clear account of any of the mini-worlds our planet hosts. Owen was a fairly unremarkable man until his journey into Casca. He wasn't a bad person per se, but he was from a young age lazy, shiftless, and later something of a conman. His lifestyle was not brought about by any major tragedy or because society had mistreated him. On the contrary, Owen came from an extremely well-off background, had very loving parents, and a large circle of friends, all of whom often had to bail him out of trouble several times, even before his turn to a life of crime. He just simply hated having to work, at the very least, and really this is the only thing we can say in his favour from that point in his life. Owen did maintain some basic decency and never targeted the poor or the downtrodden in his frauds and schemes. He only ever went after the elites he had rubbed shoulders with for years, many of whom he knew hadn't acquired their fortune through the most honest means anyway. To be fair to Owen, even his own father had only achieved his wealth through backstabbing his partners, dodgy deals, and some crooked connections, as much as he always tried to pretend otherwise to his children. Though they did truly love their son, Owen's parents perhaps weren't the best role models for him growing up. But even then, Owen still should have tried to use the wealth they provided for him to set a new example and break free from the crooked background he came from. Instead, he used their wealth to behave like a spoiled brat, until even they became embarrassed at his behaviour and cut him off, hoping he would be humbled enough to settle down. Instead, he simply exploited his friends in a similar fashion, and when even they got tired of him, he finally turned to scamming as many people as he could. Sadly for Owen, he lacked his father's skill for duplicity, and only had a few successes, whilst making many powerful enemies along the way. By the time he was 25 in 2024, Owen was a wanted man, not just by the authorities, but the largest and most powerful gang in his home city of Darrow, known as the Armstrongs, which forced him to leave the city and flee across England. Eventually, after a few weeks on the run, Owen settled down with a young woman named Megan, who was an old enemy to the Armstrongs. Owen, at the very least, always was quite a charmer to the ladies, though in this case, Megan only gave him shelter in the hopes of gaining information about the Armstrongs. She had actually been the one to seek Owen out when she realised several Armstrong agents were in town and wanted to know why they were after Owen to such an extent. At the same time, Owen himself had only arrived in this village because he knew that it was one of the few areas in England the Armstrongs didn't have their hooks into, at least not to the same extent yet, though again that didn't stop them from sending their agents in for odd jobs. When she saw Owen had nothing, Megan was prepared to throw him out, but he tried to convince her that he could still be of help. She relented simply because she could see Owen was so terrified that he was willing to do anything to escape the gangsters and could perhaps be a useful patsy to her. Megan was about to make a very dangerous journey to the Vela Wood, and it couldn't hurt to have help, or alternatively, perhaps someone to feed to the horrors of the wood if things got out of control. This small area of forest was located on the northeast coast of England. It was accessible by a single road off the M13 motorway, known as Dalker's Road, which was nicknamed the Lost Road. Vela Wood was generally avoided even in the modern world, as according to folklore, it was said to have been inhabited by ghosts, demons, and all manner of strange, malevolent, unnatural phenomenon. The general population at this time believed the supernatural to be nothing but lies and superstition, hence why their society fell when they learned the truth. Yet even with this mass delusion, the reputation Vela Woods had built up meant that even the most cynical skeptic dared not put it to the test. At the very end of the forest was a small village on the coast run by demons known as Sharpville. The village's port was where magics and even creatures from all over the world for sorcerers and demons to buy on the black market throughout the entire UK were delivered. Over the centuries, the village had built up one of the largest and most unique collections of magics ever seen. Finally, the village also served as a transport service for demons and supernatural creatures too, such as vampires who obviously could not travel by conventional means due to their vulnerability to the sun. Megan, who was an aspiring witch, knew of an important shipment of dark magics that were being delivered to Sharpville in a few days. She had been part of a renegade coven that often did business with Sharpville. Sadly, however, they had all been slaughtered, except for Megan herself, by the Armstrongs. Both the coven and the gangsters had originated in Darrow, with the Armstrongs having kicked the coven out in the 90s, following the brief demon uprising in the early part of the decade. Still, one of Megan's contracts in Sharpville, specifically the demon lover of the head of the former coven, informed Megan of the important shipment which he promised to help her steal to use against the gangsters. He still loved the head of the coven, even after all this time, and wanted to avenge her. It was a foolish move on her and the demon's part, and a gross overestimation of her abilities, but to be fair, much like Owen, she really didn't have much choice. The Armstrongs also employed the supernatural and had many demons, vampires and witches scattered throughout England, and they had already made horrific examples of the rest of her coven and their other enemies. Megan wasn't going to remain in the tiny village outside of their reach for the rest of her life, and even there, she wasn't completely safe. Owen, however, more through his own stupidity than anything else, didn't really know much about the area's reputation and happily agreed to accompany Megan for, in hindsight, what sounded like a suicidal proposal. The next day, Megan drove them there, managing to slip out past the Armstrongs' agents and onto the M13, and then finally down the lost road. And it had already started to get dark by the time they were even on the lost road. It was a quiet road, though the few cars that passed by were very strange. One that appeared behind Megan and then sped recklessly in front of her, nearly colliding with her car in the process, was bright red in colour and had no top. Instead, there were 2 rows of chairs above the driver's seat at the bottom, as well as 2 pipes at the top of the vehicle that faced backwards and from which black smoke emerged. In each of the 3 rows sat strange figures wearing black hoods who cackled and jeered at Megan. Perhaps even stranger was a large pickup truck that sped by on the other side of the road. It contained, rather than vehicles, what looked like a large, winged reptile chained to a metal platform, with the beast also appearing to be sedated. It was also driven by what looked like a skeleton that even glanced at Megan and Owen's car for a second. Owen couldn't believe it and asked Megan to stop, but she ignored him. Even that sight was soon eclipsed by the gruesome spectacle of several dead animals, roadkill essentially, coming to life at the side of the road and circling a car that appeared to have had an accident. Megan even briefly stopped to see if she could help. Despite her rough demeanour, she wasn't completely heartless. The car's door had been ripped off, and its occupant instantly headed back in. As the zombie foxes and honey badgers drew closer, several more people then emerged from the car carrying large weapons and started to repel the zombie animals. Megan sped off, but just before she did, Owen could see that the inside of the car looked far bigger than the outside, somehow. It was almost like a mansion inside this tiny vehicle. It wasn't just the cars that were strange. On either side of the road, as it got darker, Owen could see that the trees of the forest began to light up. It looked beautiful in a way, almost like an enchanted wood. But given what they'd already seen on this road, it was probably wise not to get too close. He also saw what looked like two bipedal foxes dancing together in front of the forest. Further down, a strange hitchhiker soon emerged from the glowing forest. He was wearing ratty clothes, was bald, and had completely white skin and bright red eyes. The car carrying the cloaked figures up ahead shouted at him, with one of them even waving a flaming torch. When Megan's car passed, however, the figure suddenly jumped over 20 feet through the air and landed on top of the car, causing it to spin out of control and very nearly crash at the side of the road. The creature then ripped the roof open with its inhuman strength. Megan, in response, lifted out a cross. Owen didn't know it at the time, but the attacker was a vampire, part of a pack who made this area their hunting grounds by picking off stray cars. Sure enough, as Megan was concentrating on fighting off the vampire on the roof, several more began to emerge from the glowing woods, all hissing and baring their blood-stained fangs. Owen had never felt so helpless. Growing up in Darrow, he had certainly heard the old stories about its history of the supernatural, and even seen a few things himself, but fortunately he had been shielded from them by his wealth and family. To be fair to him, Megan wasn't much better. She didn't know magic well enough to use combat spells, and she wasn't even that well versed on vampire lore anyway, having been the lowest ranked member of the coven. She knew at least that the cross was a weakness of this particular breed, but after only managing to push it back a few feet with the holy symbol, the bloodsucker batted it out of her hand and pulled Megan up through the hole in the roof it had created. Owen grabbed onto her legs and tried to pull her back down, but it was no use, and the vampire soon threw Megan to the horde outside, who started to torture her for their own amusement. Owen, meanwhile, picked up Megan's cross, left the car, and tried to fend off the vampires. Again, though he was able to drive them back, the bloodsucker from the roof jumped him from behind before he could retaliate and sent the cross flying out of his hand. Just as all hope seemed lost, a strange whistling sound brought the vampires to their knees. A large, pale-faced, somewhat handsome but strange-looking man then emerged from behind them and helped Megan and Owen to their feet and back into their vehicle. Megan instantly drove off down the road before the vampires could recover. The figure then introduced himself as Noel. He was a Shadmock. These creatures were hybrid monsters. It is possible for some vampire breeds to have children, not just with each other, but other supernatural creatures that are closely related to them or share a connection with vampires, such as werewolves and ghouls. Hybrids of vampires and werewolves and ghouls are also capable of having children, which can produce a number of strange hybrid creatures, such as the Raddy, Maddie, and the most dreaded of all, the Shaddy. Those hybrids, such as the Shaddy's offspring, are known as mocks, and finally, if a mock were to mate with any of the other hybrids, the result would be a Shadmock, which are exceptionally rare creatures. Many vampires, werewolves, and even other hybrids actually consider shadmocs to be abominations. This hatred, however, likely stems from fear, as shadmocs, whilst the weakest physically of their family tree, possess a tremendous magical power which, at full strength, can completely and utterly destroy not just a creature's body, but its soul. Virtually no life form is immune, from vampires to demons to any natural creature. This magical power takes the form of a kind of whistle that the shadmocs must learn. It must be said that only very few shadmocs are skilled enough to learn the whistle to the extent that they can destroy souls. Noel, meanwhile, as he explained to Owen and Megan, did not possess anywhere near that level of power, and at best could only use his whistle to temporarily hurt his enemies. At the very least, he was skilled enough to make sure it only hurt those he wanted it to, however. Despite the fact that the shadmoc had saved their lives, Megan was not happy about taking him on as a hitchhiker. Not surprisingly, she didn't trust anything from this neck of the woods, but Owen, who ironically, despite his past, was a bit more naive and trusting, took a liking to Noel and convinced Megan to keep him for the time being. Noel wasn't happy about going back to Sharpville and begged Megan to let him ride in the car, which she reluctantly agreed to, saying she wasn't going to be in the village for long, though she obviously didn't tell him what she was going there for. The shadmoc, meanwhile, also explained to them that he simply wanted out of this area. He was born and raised in Sharpville, but had always felt like something of an outsider to the people of the area. He apparently took a liking to the beautiful, magical animals of the forest, which the other monsters of Sharpville found abhorrent. Shadmocs are capable of feeling human emotions due to the fact that there is some werewolf blood in them, and werewolves obviously still retain their humanity. This is another reason vampires and ghouls at least are wary of them. Noel eventually clashed with the monsters when they wanted to expand the village and exterminate the magical creatures of the forest, and fled into the woods where he claimed to have been living for the last few months in a desperate existence. Having realised that there was nothing he could do to protect the forest any longer, Noel wanted a new start. But up until their arrival, he hadn't met anyone willing to help him, which wasn't too surprising given the nature of the people who drove up the lost road. Those vampires had actually been pursuing him, but had become distracted by the very few humans who had passed by. Noel wasn't being entirely honest with Megan and Owen, however. Whilst it is true that he did have more human emotions than the other creatures of Sharpville, a large part of why he ultimately fled was because his father, his shaddy daddy, was an infamous figure within the village who had made many enemies over the years. Noel also hadn't been living in the wild for as long as he claimed either, with his father having only recently been dethroned, so to speak, over a dispute with the latest shipment to Sharpville, ironically the one that Megan naively thought she could steal. Noel's father had believed it to be too dangerous and wanted it destroyed, whilst the others were adamant about using its power. Still, Owen bought into Noel's story, and even, rather foolishly, believed he could relate to Noel, defying his parents, who didn't understand him. Further down the road, Megan, Noel and Owen saw more strange sights, including a gigantic two-headed man emerging from the ground just in front of the woods. The giant attacked a car that had been spun off the other side of the road by the cloaked figures who had rammed it from their side, making the vehicle swerve into the woods. Why the cloaked figures had done this, Megan and the others had no idea, but as the car attempted to make its way back to the road, it was suddenly ambushed by this apex predator. The creature, aside from being over 70 feet tall, was also covered in red fur, except for its 2 necks and heads. Its hands, however, resembled those of a bird of prey and were similarly scaly. Meanwhile, both of its 2 heads were bald, with green skin, and they both had 3 eyes each, which were also all completely black with no pupil. Finally, its fangs resembled those of a tarantula. Owen could see one of the car's occupants hanging from the window, a young man screaming for help. Sadly, there was nothing they could do from here, and Megan quickly got the car out of there before any other giants could emerge. Not long after, the trio came across another hitchhiker, a young woman dressed completely in white clothes. She was a lady in white, famous demonic spirits from hell that lure passers-by into their dark dimensions. They tend to favour more remote areas such as motorways and roads. The Shadmock told his 2 comrades not to look into her eyes and they'd be fine. Owen, however, foolishly couldn't take his eyes off of her for some reason, likely her power, which was known to have an instant effect on weak minds. As they drove by, Owen, who was utterly captivated by her beauty, and even started to think she felt the same way, suddenly noticed her eyes turn to flames, with a cruel smile also starting to appear on her lips. He then suddenly found himself trapped in a dark area, surrounded by a circle of flames, whilst skeletons hovered above the fire and danced and sang in a strange language. The lady in white then appeared to walk through the flames towards a terrified Owen, smiling. She was, in that second, quite possibly the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, and leaned in to kiss him, which he was only too happy to accept. Her lips, however, were burning to the touch. It was absolute agony, with the pain in Owen's lips running straight through his entire body. Owen tried to pull away almost instantly, but her grip was immense, and as it went on, the pain only seemed to get worse. Fortunately, he was snapped out of the trance by Megan, who violently grabbed Owen's nose, twisted it, and used it to pull him away from the glance of the lady in white as they finally passed her. Noel, and even Megan, who could see how shaken Owen was by the experience, asked if he was okay. Noel also tried to explain that the lady pulls your soul out of your body whilst you are still alive, and that just for a second, Owen's soul was actually trapped in her hell dimension, and had Megan not interrupted, his soul would have been severed from his body permanently and trapped there. Owen sincerely thanked Megan, but wasn't comfortable sharing what he had seen, at least not yet. Not long after escaping the lady in white, they were greeted with a mundane and therefore on this road most unusual sight, a little chef, which seemed to be functioning normally. "That's odd. I didn't think there were any little chefs left," Owen said. "Seriously, that's what you think is odd about this road?" Megan replied. "Trust me, that is the most well-guarded place in this entire area. You don't want to mess with the dark powers within there," Noel warned them. Not long after they passed the little chef, they suddenly came to a stop. The car with the cloaked figures had also stopped, and they were trying their best to scare away a large dinosaur-like creature that was standing in the middle of the road. It was roughly 30 feet long, stood about 10 feet tall, and had 4 legs and a short muscular tail. Its skin was bright green, and it was covered in thick plated scales. Meanwhile, its head was long and shaped like an allosaurus, whilst a large horn adorned the top of its nose. Owen and Megan were sure it was a dinosaur, even if it didn't look like any they had seen. The animal had just been crossing the road when the cloaked figure's car almost collided with it. Unfortunately, the beast naturally saw them as a threat, and both refused to back down, with the figures waving their torches from the car whilst the dinosaur roared. Megan, Owen and Noel were completely stuck. "Go on, use your whistle or whatever you said it was," Megan asked. "I've never used it on anything that big, I don't know," Noel tried to explain. Sadly, both Megan and Owen insisted, as not surprisingly, they didn't want to spend a minute longer in this place than they had to. Noel's whistle, however, did nothing but enrage the dinosaur that instantly charged at them. The cloaked figures, thinking that the dinosaur was attacking them, they hadn't even noticed Megan's car, started to attack the dinosaur. Armed with their torches, the fire of each torch was completely made out of magic, as it only appeared after an enchantment. The figures jumped out of their car and pushed the dinosaur back the way, surrounding it in a perfect circle. The dinosaur started to scream and panic, and as one of the group tried to reach forward and burn it in the face, the horned beast, in response, managed to grab onto his leg with its jaws and threw him into several more of the cloaked figures, after which it charged at 2 more, crushing one underfoot and scooping another up in its jaws, who it started to eat alive. The animal then headed towards Megan's car and flipped it through the air, despite her attempts to reverse. Owen was briefly knocked out in the crash, but when he came to, he saw the mangled corpse of one of the cloaked figures hanging from above. The dinosaur, after eating its fill, had spat the top half of its victim over the upturned car. Owen screamed and struggled frantically. Fortunately, Megan, who had managed to escape, returned and helped pull Owen out, whilst Noel was distracting the dinosaur with his whistle. By the time Megan had pulled Owen to safety, the dinosaur, further angered by Noel's whistle, chased him down the road. Owen and Megan, with no choice, headed for the woods on the other side. They waited for a few minutes for Noel, with Owen insisting that they wait longer, when suddenly a hand placed itself on Owen's shoulder. He turned around and punched the figure. The first time he'd ever thrown a punch in his life, only to see that it was Noel who had managed to barely give the dinosaur the slip. He did know these woods fairly well, after all, from his childhood. The beast, however, was still close by, and they could hear it roaring. Noel told them they needed to head for the little chef. Despite what he had said earlier, he knew they wouldn't last long in these woods with that creature after them, and they soon ran back up the road, with the dinosaur emerging from the woods in pursuit until they reached the little chef, which, despite what Noel said, was not guarded. In fact, they were able to enter it no problem, though the dinosaur itself suddenly stopped and retreated back into the forest. It looked like a normal little chef inside, though there was only one person behind the counter and a waitress standing at the back of the room. They both had an eerie quality to them, though otherwise looked normal. In fact, the waitress was even quite pretty. "Can I help you?" the man behind the counter asked, almost as surprised as they were that they had been able to enter. He didn't seem angry, though. In fact, he appeared quite happy. Our car was attacked by that, well, I don't know what, Megan said. Looked like a Crystalosaurus to me. Omnivores. They prefer flesh if they can get it. We get a few of them around these parts. Don't worry, though, nothing can enter this place if we don't want it, the waitress said. Those words weren't quite as comforting to the trio as he had hoped. Do you mean you wanted us to come in here? What for? Did you set that thing on us? Megan replied. Not at all. I honestly don't care if you're here or not. It's more that we don't see you as a threat, so you're free to stay as long as you want, the waitress replied. If you want my advice, I'd stay the night. The forest can be a very dangerous place when it's dark. Stay the night here, then in the morning try and make it back up the road while you can. I'm afraid we can't do anything other than give you shelter. If you are going to stay, don't worry about the vampires, demons, and other monsters that show up outside. They always gather here, but they can't ever get in. And also don't worry about the ladies in white. Their cheap tricks don't work here either, the man behind the counter interjected. Owen once again was up for staying, and even started looking at the menu, whilst Megan felt the entire thing was a trick. Noel, meanwhile, had heard conflicting things about this place. The monsters he'd grown up with viewed it as a cursed place of no return, whilst other human visitors or unfortunates who had been trapped viewed it as a refuge. He had taken a huge chance in a moment of terror, but now that he had time to take it in, he was having some doubts. After some more arguing, Megan and Noel agreed for now, in case the Crystalosaurus came back, though only Owen ordered a meal, a full English, despite it being night time, which he thought was quite nice. He even tried to get to know the waitress, again foolishly thinking his charm was his greatest asset. To be fair to Owen, while she was at first quite cold and unresponsive, she eventually opened up to Owen a bit, probably because she was just relieved to talk to anyone. She and her co-worker didn't appear to have the best relationship. The waitress told Owen that her village was poor, and that she had taken this job only to make ends meet, and that back where she was from, it was a lot worse than even out there in those woods. She also told Owen that even though she was flattered by him wanting to know her, he wouldn't fit in with her lot, though she gave him some advice. Don't go upstairs. She didn't explain why, saying that even in a place like this he wouldn't believe it, but to never put it to the test. Finally, she also told him her name was Kalina, and the man behind the counter was called Okan. As the hours rolled on, more horrors from the woods began to emerge. A small raptor-like dinosaur walked by the doors, and after noticing the people inside, became excited and started snarling and screeching at the doors. The animal was about 10 feet in length, and stood as tall as the average man. It was covered in scales except for a line of bright red feathers which ran down from the top of its head to the back of its tail. Its green eyes pierced the darkness, whilst its snout was covered in the blood of its previous unfortunate victims. The creature's breath, as well as the blood from its jaws, steamed up the glass before it eventually left. The trio were later distracted by another car being stopped and pushed over by more vampires. If they're driving down this road, then they're not just a family going on holiday. Fuck them. They're here to get hold of some of the darkest magics on Earth, Megan said. So are we, Owen replied. Yes, and I didn't expect anybody to come and help us, Megan said back. As the vampires tore one of the passengers out from the overturned car's window, a young man who it promptly bit in the neck, draining him in less than a minute, Owen decided he couldn't take it anymore and rushed out of the 2 doors, with Megan and Noel both following him. Megan didn't even know why she was bothering. She still didn't particularly like Owen, She had found his attempts to make small talk in the car beyond tedious, but deep down it seemed no matter how hard she liked to pretend she was after her cousin's death, Megan still had just a twinge of empathy for those around her. As intensely annoying as Owen may have been, it was harder for her to shut off him being ripped apart by those monsters than a complete stranger. The great tragedy is that Megan was right. The men below were actually agents of the Armstrongs who had followed Megan and Owen down the road. They were low-level thugs without any supernatural powers, as the Armstrongs didn't want to waste any of their finest killers on what they viewed as imbeciles, like Megan and Owen. Still, Owen, perhaps proving the Armstrongs' point, dragged his friends outside to try and unknowingly save his attempted killers. The Shadmock performed his whistle, which again made the vampires clutch their ears in pain. Owen and Megan ran to help the last two survivors, 2 men, one young, one older, but Noel couldn't maintain his whistle for long. As it wore off, the vampires soon came galloping up the road to the little chef. Worse, just as Owen and the others reached the little chef, the raptor returned and blocked off the doors. The dinosaur had been waiting the entire time, or rather it seemed had stamped out its new territory in the area. Trapped between a dinosaur and several bloodthirsty vampires, Noel would have to wait a minute before he could use his whistle again, as he had to let the energy recharge, and the Shadmock had already used a lot of it up tonight. Sadly, a minute would be more than long enough for any of the monsters to rip them apart. Megan tried her best to remember any kind of combat spell, even just some funny lights to distract them, but Owen predictably tried to fight the dinosaur. It was a step up, to be fair, from just screaming like he did last time, but sadly the raptor simply knocked him down and then wrapped its jaws around his leg as it tried to drag him away to its nearby nest. Megan tried to pull him back, but it was no use. Meanwhile, Noel was soon surrounded by 3 of the vampires. Just then, the waitress emerged from the little chef and sprinkled holy water on the vampires, which caused them all to burn. She also fired an energy blast from her hand, which sent the dinosaur flying too, before she helped them all get into the little chef. Inside, Okan was furious with Kalina. "What were you thinking? You know the rules. We are not allowed to interfere," he shouted. "We were already giving them shelter," she insisted. "That's different and you know it. It's one thing for this gateway to be a neutral place people can enter. It's another for us to actively attack the creatures from Sharpville," he replied. "What would you have me do? Leave them to be ripped apart?" she argued. "Yes, we've turned countless people in the past away to those horrors," he said. "They're different. The gateway let these people in because they weren't deemed a threat," she replied. "Only the first 3. The last 2 you let in because you wanted to. They at least must go back outside," he ordered. One of the 2 gangsters, the elder, tried to punch Okan, only to be sent backwards by an invisible magical force across the room and knocked out cold. The waitress continued to argue with her boss, whilst outside Owen could see the raptor engaging some of the vampires in a fight. The dinosaur seemed to have the upper hand, and sent one of the vampires crashing to the ground with a whip from its tail, before biting another that tried to strike it on the arm, after which it then threw her into the other vampires. Still, even the dinosaur knew instinctively it couldn't take them all on at once, and as their flesh was putrid and already dead anyway, then none of the vampires would be of use to it as food either, so the raptor soon wisely sped off in the other direction. Okan and Kalina's argument soon turned violent, but he emerged the victor and easily knocked Kalina out with a spell. In response, Owen picked up a chair and prepared to strike him with it, but Okan simply batted it out of the way with another blast. "Don't worry, I've not harmed her, though I'm afraid I'll have to report what she's done back home. Meanwhile, none of you can be trusted after that display. You'll all have to go," Okan said. "Well, aren't you a little job's worth?" Owen replied. Okan, however, simply responded by making both of the doors open with his mind, after which all 5 of the unwanted guests felt themselves walking towards the entrance against their will, with the gangster being revived. The vampires all walked up to the door of the little chef, waiting patiently, especially the ones with burn marks from the holy water. Fortunately, Kalina wasn't quite as out of it as Okan had hoped, and knocked him out with 2 blasts from her hands, after which she fainted. The others were released from his control, but they didn't know what to do. There was no way they could face the vampires. Even if the Shadmock's whistle temporarily held them back, there was nowhere for them to flee in this forest. One of the 2 people they had rescued suggested they go upstairs, but Owen was the first to tell him it was off limits. Why, he had no idea, but unfortunately the 2 gangsters didn't wait around, and as Okan started to get up, both Noel and Megan followed the gangsters up the stairs, with Owen not wanting to have to face the vampires on his own following as well, though only after picking Kalina up over his shoulder. As soon as they reached the top of the stairs, however, they all suddenly found themselves in a strange cave. Behind them, in the direction they had just come from, was a rocky wall. Owen, after putting Kalina down, put his hand on the wall and fell through it, suddenly finding himself back in the little chef. He almost fell down the steps but regained his footing and instantly went back when he saw Okan stand up, only to find himself back in the cave. The five soon fled through the damp cave system ahead until they reached the exit. Outside the cave it was bright daylight, but before them was a sight far more horrifying than anything in the forest. Even Noel, who had grown up around monsters, couldn't believe what he was seeing. There were hundreds of crucified demon corpses in a gigantic quarry. Some of the corpses appeared to be mangled and mutilated, whilst others had become nothing but skeletons. "What the hell kind of place is this?" Megan said.